Hello and welcome to the class. The discussion which we are going to have today is about international initiatives and efforts for promotion and protection of women's rights. UN support for the rights of women began with the organization's founding charter. One of the purposes of the UN Declaration in Article 1 of its charter is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Within the UN's first year, the Economic and Social Council established its Commission on the Status of Women as the principal global policy-making body dedicated exclusively to gender equality and advancement of women. Among its earliest accomplishments was ensuring gender-neutral language in the draft Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For a long time, women's rights have been excluded from traditional discourse on human rights. The traditional discourse on human rights has developed without considering its impact upon women. Transforming this discourse to a perspective that will consider the needs and vindications of women is absolutely essential. Although international efforts addressing women's issues presumed to be associated with women began in the 19th century. It was in the post-war period that such activity gained a coherent focus under the auspices of United Nations. The United Nations was created following World War II. Its purpose and the basic principles it affirms, including the principle of non-discrimination, are set forth in the UN Charter. In 1946, the Commission on the Status of Women was created. The Commission has played a very important role in the process of elaborating the human rights mechanisms adopted within the framework of the United Nations. As the human rights provisions in the United Nations Charter were extremely vague and general, it soon became apparent that they would need to be specified. Therefore, interested states parties drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted on December 10, 1948. The Universal Declaration is also an important document in respect to women's rights. Article 1, 2 also reiterate the principle of non-discrimination. In 1966, the United Nations adopted 2 international covenants on human rights: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. In addition to promoting human rights, these covenants also contain specific reference to the principle of non-discrimination. Discrimination against women has now become a global issue. In this regard, the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, in 1979 was an important milestone which marked an international commitment to the cause of women's rights. Known as the International Bill of Rights for Women, it was adopted in the middle of the UN decade for women entering into force on September 3rd, 1981, following the deposit with the Secretary General of the United Nations of the 20th Instrument of Ratification or Accession. Currently, 185 countries, over 90% of the members of the United Nations, are parties to the Convention. It is now the second most widely ratified international human rights treaty. CEDAW represents the most serious systematic attempt by the United Nations to fight decidedly for the rights of women. Commission on the Status of Women. The Charter designates the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, and the Secretariat as the principal organs that have primary responsibility for human rights, including the rights of women. In 1946, the Council established the Commission on Human Rights, and recognizing that the Commission would need advice on problems relating to the status of women, also set up a sub-commission on the status of women. The Council later that year expanded the sub-commission into a full commission that reported directly to the Council. Originally, the Commission had 15 members, but consistent with the expansion of the membership of the United Nations, membership had increased to 45 members as of 1989. The Commission over the years has developed a three-part mandate. The first is to prepare recommendations and reports to the Economic and Social Council on promoting women's rights in political, economic, social, and educational fields. It must prepare recommendations and reports to the Council on urgent problems requiring immediate attention in the field of women's rights, with the object of implementing the principle that men and women shall have equal rights, and to develop proposals to give effect to such recommendations. Includes the functions of promoting equality, development, and peace, monitoring the implementation of measures for the advancement of women, and reviewing and appraising progress made at all levels, including national, sub-regional, regional, sectoral, and global. In line with its mandate, one of the most important endeavors of the Commission is the writing of declarations and treaties. Two of its greatest achievements are the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The declaration was proclaimed by the General Assembly in 1967. Although legally non-binding, its comprehensive scope defined the policy and goals of the United Nations regarding gender equality. It also set the stage for the convention, which entered into force in 1981. The declaration proclaims in Article 1 that discrimination against women is fundamentally unjust and constitutes an offense against human dignity. It urges states to take all appropriate measures to abolish discriminatory laws, customs and practices in the political, social, economic and cultural life of the nation. Now, let us talk about International Women's Year 1975. The goals of the International Women's Year were to promote equality, to ensure the full integration of women in the total development effort, and to recognize the contribution of women to world peace. The focal point of the observance of the year was the World Conference of the International Women's Year, which was held in Mexico City and was attended by over 1,000 representatives from 133 states. The conference adopted the Declaration of Mexico on the Equality of Women and their contribution to development and peace 1975 and the World Plan of Action for the implementation of the objectives of the International Women's Year, in addition to adopting other important documents. One of the most important resolutions of the conference was the recommendations to establish an international research and training institute for the advancement of women, that is INSTRO. Its purposes were the collection and dissemination of information, the design of research for monitoring changes, the development of training program for women to do research, assume leadership roles, and increase earning possibilities. Now coming to the United Nations Decade for Women, which took place between 1976 to 1985. The success of the International Women's Year led to the decision to celebrate a Women's Decade. The General Assembly designated the years 1976 to 1985 as the United Nations Decade for Women. Equality, development and peace. Among the main goals of the decade were the full observance of gender equality and the elimination of de jure and de facto discrimination. Two world conferences were held during the decade. The World Conference of the United Nations Decade for Women, Equality, Development and Peace was held in Copenhagen in 1980. Attended by more than 2,000 delegates from 145 states, the conference formulated the program of action for the second half of the United Nations Decade for Women 1980 to 1985. In 1985, the World Conference to review and appraise the achievements of the United Nations Decade for Women, Equality, Development and Peace was held in Nairobi. It is notable that each conference brought wider world participation. At this third conference, there were representatives from 157 states and several liberation organizations, the latter group attending in the capacity of observers. Now let us talk about the Nairobi forward-looking strategies for the advancement of women. The Nairobi forward-looking strategies are currently the major policy instruments of the United Nations on the advancement of women. These strategies were adopted by consensus at the Nairobi Conference in 1985. Based upon the three key concepts of equality, development and peace, the document outlines obstacles to the advancement of women, strategies for overcoming them, and measures for the implementation of the basic strategies at the national level. First of all, let us talk about the early conventions dealing with women's rights. Before the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the United Nations instruments dealing with gender equality and the rights of women addressed very specific issues such as prostitution and the nationality of married women. The General Assembly approved the Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others in 1949 and entered into force in 1951. Adopted by the General Assembly in 1959, the Convention on the Political Rights of Women entered into force in 1954. This convention guaranteed women's right to vote, to be eligible for public election, and to hold public office on equal terms with men without any distinction. The Convention on the Nationality of Married Women was adopted by the General Assembly in 1957 and entered into force in 1958. In 1964, the Convention on Consent to Marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriages, which had been adopted by the General Assembly in 1962, entered into force. Now let us talk about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. CEDAW is a concrete commitment designed to implement the principles set forth in the Declaration. CEDAW reiterates that discrimination against women violates the principles of equality, of rights and respect for human dignity. It also acknowledges the great contribution of women to the welfare of the family and to the development of society, and calls for a change in the traditional role of man as well as the role of women in society and in the family. Now let us talk about the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Article 17 of CEDAW establishes the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women to monitor the progress made in the implementation of the Convention. The primary mandate of the committee is the consideration of reports submitted by state parties on the legislative, judicial, administrative or other measures adopted to give effect to the provisions of the Convention. In addition, the committee may make suggestions and general recommendations to the General Assembly based on the reports and information received from the state parties. And to conclude, as we are now in the 21st century, the reality of violations against women's rights and oppression is really a matter of concern. Many developed and developing nations are used to in violating women's rights both at the national and international level. Parallel to this, an international tolerance of discrimination against women has been persistent. Many nations are able to turn a blind eye to such violations by successfully putting forward the sovereignty argument, which effectively excludes criticisms from outside. An international common effort is called for to introduce positive changes advancing women's rights.